Hello everyone and welcome to my Soap Twist 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Bridget had always been the group's glue, keeping them together through every storm. At 32, she still possessed the same ferocious resolve that had defined her since infancy, her dark hair usually pulled back in a sloppy bun, as if she didn't have time for anything unnecessary. She'd grown up in this house, a weathered two-story relic of happier times, where her mother baked bread and her father told stories about his fishing trips. But those days were long gone, replaced by hospital visits, whisper disputes, and the gradual unfolding of a family secret that had been brewing for decades. The DNA test was meant to be the answer, the key to discovering the truth about her father's disappearance 20 years prior. Bridget had spent years following rumors, piecing together parts of stories, and pulling her friends into a quest that had captivated her. Now the findings were in, and they were not what she had hoped for. Electra stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly, peering out at the rain as if it could soothe the anguish in her chest. She was the group's firecracker, quick-witted and sharp-tongued, with dyed red hair to match her restless energy. At 30, she was a photographer, always looking for the perfect snap, but her lens had recently captured more of their suffering than their delight. Electra had been the one who pushed Bridget to take the DNA test and cease living under the shadow of uncertainties. "You deserve to know," she'd repeated 100 times, her voice full of passion. However, as she looked at the paper in Bridget's hands, she felt a hollow dread. The truth was not freedom, it was a cage. Electra's life had been a succession of escapes, from a damaged childhood to transient loves, and she had always trusted Bridget's strength to carry them all. But seeing her friend's face now, crumpled with anguish, Electra wondered whether she had gone too far. Katie sat on the sagging couch, her knees drawn up to her chest and her blonde hair falling in a curtain over her face. At 28, she was the youngest of the four, the quiet one who listened more than spoke. She was a nurse, accustomed to mending wounds and relieving suffering, but this was an injury she couldn't repair. Katie had always been the peacemaker, calming down fights and bringing tea when words failed. She'd been there when Bridget's mother died 2 years ago, holding her hand through the funeral, and when Will had a breakdown last summer, talking him through it. But as the DNA results revealed the reality, Katie felt helpless. The paper proved what they'd all suspected. Bridget's father hadn't simply disappeared. He'd become someone else entirely, someone whose secrets had ripped their lives apart. Katie's tears poured softly, her heart breaking for Bridget and all of them. Will walked the room, his boots leaving damp footprints on the ancient rug. He was 33 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, and he spoke with a quiet intensity that made people pay attention. He'd been Bridget's best friend since she was a child, the one who climbed trees with her and stayed up late thinking of adventures. Will was now a mechanic, his hands perpetually covered with grease, but he had never been able to fill the void left by Bridget's father's absence. He'd been the skeptic, warning Bridget that looking into the past could cause more harm than good. "Some things are better left buried," he'd remarked, but Bridget's insistence had driven him down. He wished he had fought harder now that he saw her frail face and red eyes. The DNA test not only confirmed Bridget's father's death, but it also showed a betrayal involving Will's own family, a reality that twisted the knife even more. Bridget's father, Thomas, disappeared without a trace 20 years ago. The official explanation was that he went out on his fishing boat and never returned, lost at sea. Bridget was 12 years old, and the loss had transformed her into someone who never gave up and thought that if you tried hard enough, you would find answers. However, suspicions persisted that Thomas had not died, had fled, or had been involved in something sinister. Bridget had spent her adult life chasing those whispers, looking for old friends, going through records, and ultimately ordering the DNA test that would compare her profile to a database of missing people and unexplained remains. She had hoped it would confirm he had died at sea, giving her some closure. Instead, it became clear that Thomas was not her biological father at all. The findings pointed to a man named Daniel Harper, whose name meant little to Bridget but everything to Will. Daniel had been Will's uncle, a charismatic vagabond who had come through town years before, dazzling Bridget's mother, Ellen, during a difficult period in her marriage. The encounter had been brief and private, but it had left an impression, a daughter who was not Thomas's. When Thomas found out, he approached Daniel, and the argument became violent. The facts were vague, gleaned from old letters and half-remembered anecdotes, but the DNA test filled in the gaps. Thomas had not died at sea. He had left because he couldn't bear the treachery and couldn't look at Bridget without seeing Daniel's shadow. And Daniel? He had also vanished, leaving a trail of unanswered questions that had tormented the town ever since. Bridget slid to the floor, the paper falling from her grasp. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew I wasn't his, and he left me." The words were like a raw, gushing wound. She had spent her childhood idolizing Thomas, picturing him as a hero drowned in the waters, but now she saw him as a man who had chosen to forsake her. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the rain poured harder outside. Electra knelt next to her, her own tears streaming. "You're still you, Bridget," she responded, her voice forceful yet unsteady. Bridget shook her head, her cries muffled on her knees. "This doesn't change who you are. It changes everything." Katie stepped to Bridget's side, placing a kind hand on her friend's shoulder. She wanted to say something, anything, to alleviate her suffering, but the words would not come. She thought of her own father, who was distant but present, and the guilt of not having what Bridget had gnawed at her. Katie had always believed in the power of truth, but now she understood the cost. She looked at Will, who had stopped pacing and stood motionless, his face a mask of remorse and sadness. "Will," Katie murmured softly, "say something." But Will's jaw stiffened, and his eyes were fixated on the floor. He couldn't meet Bridget's stare, couldn't take the weight of his knowledge. Will's uncle Daniel had been a ghost in his family, a name uttered in whispers. Growing up, Will had heard stories of Daniel's charm, recklessness, and ruthlessness. When Bridget began her quest, Will had kept silent about the rumors linking Daniel and Ellen. He hoped these were merely rumors. But the DNA test confirmed the worst, and worse, it resurfaced a memory Will had suppressed. Will, who was 13 at the time, overheard his father arguing with Daniel the night Thomas went missing. "You ruined them," his father yelled, and Daniel laughed coldly and unapologetically. Will had not realized it at the time, but now he knew. Daniel's affair had broken Thomas, and Thomas's departure had broken Bridget. And by remaining silent, Will had allowed it to happen. "I'm sorry," Will murmured, his voice raspy. "I should have told you about Daniel." "I should have," he paused, choking on the words. Bridget stared up at him, her eyes flashing through tears. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice scarcely audible. "You knew, but you didn't tell me?" The betrayal went deeper than DNA results. Will had been her rock, her confidant, and the only person she trusted fully. He was now complicit in the lie. Electra stood with her fists clenched. "How could you, Will?" she snapped, her voice harsh with rage. She had always been protective of Bridget, ready to defend her, but this felt like a betrayal of them all. Katie reached for Electra's arm, hoping to calm her down, but she pushed away. "No, Katie. He does not get a pass. He let her pursue ghosts for years, knowing the truth would ruin her." Will's shoulders dropped, the fight leaving him. "I thought I was protecting you," he explained to Bridget. "I thought if you didn't know, you could keep him as your dad, the way you remembered him." Bridget's chuckle was bitter and hollow. "Are you protecting me? You allowed me to live a lie, Will. You made me believe I was his daughter, that he loved me enough to stay." She stood, her legs wobbly, and took her coat from the chair. "I can't be here," she explained, her voice breaking. She rushed past them, slamming the door behind her as she went out into the downpour. The three of them remained silent, the weight of her absence overwhelming the room. Electra's rage gave way to tiredness, and she collapsed onto the couch, head in her hands. Katie wiped her tears, hoping to find the fortitude to keep them together, but she felt like she was unraveling as well. Will looked at the door, his heart hammering. He'd lost her not only as a friend, but also as the person who had defined his life. He wanted to run after her and beg for forgiveness, but his feet would not move. The truth had shattered them all. Bridget trudged in the rain, her boots splashing in puddles, her head filled with memories and sadness. She remembered her father teaching her to fish, his laugh as they sat on the pier, and how he'd referred to her as his little captain. But those memories were now tainted by the realization that she wasn't his. She became enraged as she remembered her mother, who had kept the secret to her death. She'd spent her life looking for a man who didn't want her, and those she cared about the most had let her believe the lie. She ended herself to the same pier where she'd last seen her father, or the man she assumed was her father. The waves crashed against the pilings, producing a roar in her ears. She ripped apart the DNA findings, which were already damp from the rain, and let the wind carry them into the sea. It did not change the fact, but it seemed like rebellion, a small act of reclaiming herself. She stood there for a long time, the rain mixing with her emotions, before feeling a hand on her shoulder. Katie's face was pale and damp, her eyes full of calm strength. "You don't have to do this alone," she added softly. Behind her, Electra and Will stood, their faces etched with grief. Bridget wanted to push them away, shout at them for their quiet, but she was exhausted and broken. Instead, she let Katie draw her into a hug, which Electra quickly joined, her arms fiercely wrapped around them both. Will hesitated before stepping forward, his voice low. "I'll spend the rest of my life making this right," he told me. "If you'll let me." Bridget didn't respond, but she didn't back away either. The rain kept falling, the waves kept smashing, and the four of them stood together, broken but not defeated. The truth had crushed them, but it had not destroyed the tie they'd formed over years of laughing, arguments, and shared dreams. They were still a family, despite their flaws and fractures. And as the storm raged on, Bridget sensed a glimmer of something. Not hope, not yet, but a tenacious resolve to keep trying, to find a way through the suffering. They were prepared to face whatever came next, no matter how painful. Bridget's hands trembled as she gripped the white envelope, and her heart pounded so hard that she could hear it echo inside her chest. The paper was thin, barely concealing the lines of text inside, but the contents seemed heavier than anything she'd ever held before. The living area around her seemed too quiet and motionless. The late afternoon light slanted through the big windows, creating gold streaks on the wooden floor. The air smelled faintly like jasmine and coffee. It was supposed to be reassuring, but it was not. Nothing in this situation was comforting. Will stood a few steps away, arms crossed over his chest, and the lines around his eyes were deeper than she remembered. He'd been trying to be cool all day, but his jaw had that familiar tightness that indicated he was trying to mask his nerves. Electra reclined against the back of the couch, her fingers tapping restlessly on the cloth. Her long dark hair flowed over her shoulders, covering a portion of her face, but her eyes, those piercing eyes, never left the package in Bridget's hands. Katie sat closest to Bridget on the edge of the couch, her hands gripped tightly in her lap, her face colorless and expressionless. Bridget, on the other hand, could see the terror hidden behind her placid appearance. Katie always tried to appear composed, even while she was tearing down within. Bridget took a big breath. Her throat felt dry. "It's over," she said, her voice so quiet it nearly vanished into the silence. The words hung there for a second, floating and frail. Electra frowned. "What do you mean by it's over?" Bridget lifted her head, her lips trembling, but her eyes were filled with relief, or possibly astonishment. She slowly unfolded the paper and held it up. "The results. They're here. And it's over. We finally know." Everyone stood still for a time. Will moved closer, his breath unsteady. "Are you serious?" he inquired, his voice husky. "Have you got them?" Bridget nodded. "I received the call this morning. I didn't want to open them until everyone arrived." Katie's hand moved to her mouth. Her gaze flickered between Bridget and the paper, and her body trembled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Just tell us," she whispered. "Please. I can't handle it any longer." Bridget looked down at the paper once again. Her gaze scanned the printed sentences, which she had previously read 3 times in the kitchen before anyone arrived. She couldn't quite believe it. She gulped hard and took a long breath. It says... She halted, her voice caught. It says that Will is the father. The room fell silent for a time. Then everything broke at once. Electra gasped, bringing her palm to her chest. Katie let out a piercing shriek, which evolved into a sob. Will staggered backward, his mouth open in amazement, his hands reaching for his face. He made a sound that fell somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Bridget, still holding the paper, felt tears stream down her cheeks, tears she had no idea she was holding back. The weight she had been carrying for months, if not years, was suddenly lifted, leaving her faint and lightheaded. Will crossed the room in 2 steps and grabbed her in his arms. "Oh my God, Bridget," he said softly into her hair. I believed it couldn't be true. I felt I'd lost everything." Bridget clutched to him, sobbing quietly. "It's real," she said quietly. "It's finally real." Behind them, Katie rose up, wiping her tears and trembling. She gazed at them with an odd combination of happiness and disbelief. "After all this time," she added softly, "after all the fighting, doubts, and sleepless nights, it's finally over." Electra turned away and buried her face in her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were red, and her demeanor was gentler than normal. "I didn't think we'd ever get to this point," she admitted quietly. "A part of me didn't want to believe it, you know, because believing meant risking hope again." Bridget took a step back from Will and looked at each of them individually. "I know," she replied kindly. "However, we can stop running now. We can stop doubting." The room was filled with quiet crying, and laughter broke through the tears. For months, if not years, their lives had been entangled in a web of misunderstanding, secrets, and suffering. It had begun with a question, one that everyone had been too terrified to answer. When Bridget discovered she was pregnant, there were too many shadows in her life, too many whispered truths. The DNA test had become both a blessing and a curse, promising truth, but threatening to ruin them. Will was distant back then. He had fled, unable to bear the uncertainty. His sister, Electra, had blamed Bridget for everything, accusing her of lying and manipulating the family. Bridget's best friend, Katie, had tried to remain neutral, but she, too, experienced moments of doubt. Every conversation had become a war. Every gathering had ended with tears. Bridget had lost sleep, food, and faith in herself. The test had taken weeks, but the wait had felt like forever. As she stood there, holding the outcome in her hands, everything inside her felt fresh, raw yet new. Will's arms around her felt like a homecoming. Electra slumped back onto the couch, face buried in her hands. "I owe you an apology," she said softly, her voice quivering. "Bridget, I said terrible things to you. I suspected you were lying to protect yourself. I didn't notice how much suffering you were in." Bridget shook her head. "You were scared, Electra." Katie stepped closer, resting her hand on Electra's shoulder. "She's right," Katie whispered softly. "We've all made errors. We'll turn to face them," still holding Bridget's hand. "We were desperate to protect what little we understood." "No one's innocent in this," he added gently. "Least of all me. I walked away when I should have stayed," Bridget said, her gaze softening. "You came back," she replied simply. "That's what matters." They stood there in silence, once more, the kind that only comes after a storm. Outside, the light had changed, with the sun lower and the breeze softening. A breeze blew through the open window, bearing the smell of rain. A child's chuckle could be heard faintly down the street. It felt as if the world had exhaled. Katie stepped up to the table, where the envelope was open and the paper was half folded. She brushed it tenderly with her palm, as if it were sacred. "Are you going to keep it?" she asked Bridget. Bridget nodded. "Yes. It serves as a reminder rather than proof. About what we went through. How far we've come." Will grabbed for her hand again. "We can finally move forward," he said, his tone hard yet gentle. No more second-guessing. No more ghosts, Electra said, looking up at them thoughtfully. You two have a chance to rebuild, she explained. Bridget smiled slightly. Don't waste it. We won't. The following few hours were a flurry of laughing, tears, and old memories. They ordered meals, opened a bottle of wine saved for a special occasion, and sat at the dining table for the first time in months, without tension in the air. Conversations became easier, about everyday topics, the future, and plans that had before seemed impossible to imagine. The bitterness that had overshadowed everything was gradually fading. Bridget closed her eyes, drew a long breath, and grinned. It was finally over.